Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this first session. It's been great, and I think that as we didn't have time for audience questions during our beautiful presentations, I would love to open our conversation to the floor. If anyone has questions to either of our great participants, please go ahead and participate.
Yeah, thanks so much for all of your presentations. That was wonderful. I have a question to Claudia's presentation. Something that came to mind was the question of exile. You mentioned it briefly. And seeing that so much of, or so many of artists and intellectuals and musicians of Brazil were in exile during the dictatorship, what's the status of their activity? Alicia Clark in Paris, Elliot Jessica in London and New York, Sweli Holnick in Paris. Were archives being built during their time abroad, where they recovered to Brazil? Could you talk a bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Hello? Yeah, can you hear? It's very interesting because visual artists were not directly persecuted because it was so small and so insignificant that they were able to get away. Like something like Antonio Manuel, who took off his clothes, yes, the police was there and he was forced to leave the museum and hide. But if it was not something obvious like that, they could not even understand what was going on. So, you know, the censorship was super basic, like red is communism, black is anarchism. So that was kind of the level of censorship. So these artists that you mentioned, they did not live in exile because there is this confusion, I think, that Elliot Jessica, who is, of course, now the most famous Brazilian artist abroad, left in exile. And only left because he got a grant and he was doing a show at the Whitechapel. Alicia Clark, the same. She was teaching at the Sorbonne in Paris. That's why she left the country. I think it's very interesting, your question, because those artists specifically that you mentioned now are represented by mega galleries, right? Most of them, like, you know, Lelong and House in Worth. So they're money-making. And of course, for that, they need their archives, because their archives are also becoming commodities. I don't know how much of that was preserved, but you see that now at the Whitney Museum in New York, there is an exhibition of Elliot Jessica in New York. So after 50 years, the first exhibition that he has about those years in New York. So that material is being either produced or archived from the past. Muddy kind of answer, I guess, right?
I was last week in Brazil, and the same group, what are they called? The Evangelist group who attacked the museum show. Right. Yeah, the right wing. The same group threatened. I was participating in a video biennale called Video Brazil, and we heard that they threatened our opening by burning the house down in Sesqui. Yeah, but they didn't come. And then I started asking people in Brazil who hold archives, like, do you hold a copy of your archive in another country? Some people said, yes, we're thinking about it now.
Yeah, they just censored also a queer exhibition that was happening at the south of Brazil. It was sponsored by a bank, and because of complaints of the conservative right, they canceled the exhibition. This is just happening in Brazil, which is very strange. So they just canceled, and they were trying to bring it to Rio de Janeiro, and the mayor of Rio de Janeiro, who is extremely evangelic, said no, so the exhibition is not traveling. So there's a lot of censorship going on now because of nudity, because of sexuality. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And there is a huge counter-protest from the artists at this moment happening in Brazil. So it's a big issue now in Brazil.
I want to try and kind of pull together some of the things that came up in the session so that I can ask you kind of all three to comment. It was interesting because we start off with artists saying that they didn't want to be seen, they didn't want an archive to be built that put their work in as activism or where it was connected to the political. So then the artwork becomes the kind of archive. You showed us some examples of how an artwork became the archival material. Then we hear about artists that don't want to be have their practice archived at all, so then the exhibition becomes the form of archive. And it's completely ephemeral, and it may or may not be that the artists are interested in the fact that they're going into history through this archival process. And then we have an artist who is asking about archives that are not artistic at all, but through the very process of bringing together cultural people interested in culture and the cultural community, it's kind of expanding what archives might, or how archives might be important for cultural practice. So I'm wondering if you can kind of talk between your individual interests, how you see these relationships, or is there any kind of between the lines, do you see that there's connections between what you've been talking about or not?
Why are you two looking at me?
I haven't spoken.
Okay. Thanks, Kate, for the question. I think that gives me a bit of time also to elaborate further. What I try to touch upon in my presentation is the fact that actually in 1996, when both the artists collective in Beijing and the artists in Shanghai decided to terminate their involvement in art, they destroyed all the physical evidences and they refused to participate, which was done out of a very strong gesture against the rise of commodification of artworks in China at that time. They foresaw the kind of rise of a commercial culture rising in China, not only in the art world, but in the general society. And the artist collective and the artist Qian Weikang in Shanghai, they make the conscious decision to stop participating in that. And in 2015, when we recreated their works, we made it very clear that it's not to recreate a monument about their practices, is to open up new perspectives in terms of understanding the practices from the late 1980s to the 1990s. Because so much of the art history about contemporary in China is written around very few movements in the beginning of the 1990s that were superficially politically engaged. There were a lot of political symbols, icons being represented in the artist's works, and those works and those discourses became leading and dominant forms of art of that period, where conceptual art practices like Qian Weikang and New Measurement Group were very little recorded in the art historical narrative. If we open any history of contemporary in China right now, there will be only one sentence mention of their existence, but there is no information about how they practice. And for us, our recreation is more for our purpose of understanding this existence of those practices and how that existence has paved the way to further to other conceptual practices that came further, but there is no recognition to their practices. And we destroy all the works, all our recreations of the works after the exhibition to acknowledge the fact that the artist doesn't want any physical evidences. Yeah.
Koken, to try and get the three of you to talk, what do you think in relation to that? Because you said many people stopped practicing. You're talking about now, not the 1990s. You don't want to commodify, what the political situation and what's actually happening. But at the same time, you seem to be interested in making sure that newspapers, for example, the histories that you want to know as a cultural practitioner don't disappear. So how do you respond to?
I myself wouldn't be so crazy as an artist to make my own archive, and I understand artists trying to remain ephemeral, like into thin air, disappear. Again, that's an emotional approach. Some artists want to be eternal, some want to disappear. But there is a certain public memory that has to be preserved by some people. This is maybe a museum, especially if it's a minority in a country. They have to preserve their language, their customs. So it is a very boring work to archive, actually, but some institutions have to do it. But from individuals, especially acting as an artist or a philosopher or a musician, it's different approach. So maybe they want to de-archive, they want to un-archive. So my curiosity was how to preserve this cultural and public memory in a country, and actually in a geography where the rulers can actually perform extraordinary and unexpected acts. Last winter, everybody thought there would be a civil war in Turkey. Everybody thought we would lose our houses. Everybody thought we would lose all our economic, financial securities. So in such a time, you think at least my children should have something. The life I lived should be kind of somehow preserved because we at least had something to put up to this world. Just a very few topic. I said like the libido was down, you know, in the city and in many cities in Turkey. Not only because people didn't have the lust, but people didn't want to bring babies to this world, to Turkey. I don't know if it's changing now, but isn't that also, I don't know, some kind of collection? Or like, I don't know, making more humans. So there are people who resisted making children at this time. We have to see the results in 9 months. I don't know.
But to maybe push it a bit further, Claudia, a lot of what you've been talking about, there is the commodification of the Brazilian artists, particularly of the period under dictatorship, that is now going to Hauser and Wirth or to... So in a way, what's happening is that these artists that didn't want to be seen as political activists, that didn't want to have their work, you know, they carefully went round making an aesthetic to communicate to their communities at the time, and now it's worth a lot of money. So what's, like, if you're thinking about what the other two people have said, what's
I think it's absolutely it's a very good point that you pick up, because it's a contradiction, and that's, you know, what I wanted to show, how, you know, like Manuel, he really wanted since the beginning for his works to become a commodity, and it did become a commodity. And now all these works are historical works, and they were worth a lot of money, as you said. So it changes the game, right? I just saw, you know, an artist, Artur Barrio, I don't know if you're familiar with him, he said exactly what you're saying, that he didn't want his work to be archived, he wanted his work to disappear. I mean, the discourse was all like that. And then I just went to an exhibition last week at the Met Breuer, and his work was there digitized. So, I mean, you know, so these artists are kind of giving in to the system, because that's their moment maybe to make money. That's when the galleries are looking for them. Or so it is changing that idea that they didn't want to archive their works. I think now they regret that. Whoever didn't do it is regretting.
I wanted to also maybe pose maybe the last question of the session also to all of you, because I find that this is kind of paradoxical in a way, that we started this thinking about this conference by implying that the archive is always politically progressive. It's a practice that could be, like, it's usually viewed as something politically progressive. But I think listening to you all elaborating on what, like, pitfalls we encounter during archiving, and especially after the documents are kind of resurfacing after being unavailable for a long time, now we see that there are many dangers of archiving as a practice. And could you maybe kind of focus on what these dangers could be in relation to the topics that you are interested in.
Maybe I can play the devil's advocate in a way that I want to actually argue again the relevance of archiving in the particular context of China where I come from. Because in our current situation and in the situation of the past 7 decades, we have experienced so much dehistoricization in terms of our education. Our education, our propaganda, our whole ideological structure is very much based on the idea of forgetting, on the idea of dehistoricization, so that the Communist Party, the state, can create a particular narrative about its current ruling. And through this dehistoricization, it created a kind of mindset that we only focus on the present and we only focus on the future. So the new is always better. There is so much hierarchical sense of the new is better than the old, and the old should be destroyed. This revolutionary idea. In such a context, remembering and trying to recreate, and that's why I talk about archaeological digs and trying to bring out these things that we just forget. I mean, practices that happened in the 1990s. If you ask most people in the world in China, no one knows about them. It's so close to us, yet it's so neglected, and that's why, I mean, I looked at the archive of the garage today and I was so moved because we have nothing like that in China. What can we do? There is nothing to build on, you know?
Mm-hmm. I feel the same, I mean, about Brazil. I think it's wonderful the work you do here. I was so moved today too, because if the archives, and we're going to hear about the Biennial of São Paulo this afternoon, maybe they're doing this work, but if these archives of the artists were in the hands of institutions, it would be much easier for us to work, because when they are in the hands of the artists or the artist's heirs, which is even worse, the heirs always ask, but what is your point? What do you want to look at that, you know? So you have to explain. If they like what you're writing, great. If they don't like it, they don't give you images, they don't give you access. So it's extremely important for these archives to be in public institutions like you're doing now.
I mean, in terms of art, I have nothing to say about that. I think most art archives are maybe can be deemed more positive, but state archives, think about state archives, they're completely negative. I mean, let's talk about Ottoman archives. Ottoman archives is maintained by the Turkish Republic now. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a republic that has, good or bad, destroyed an old empire, and they have the key. So if you're a researcher to go into the Ottoman archives, we hear that one day this part is open and the other days this part is open. So the archivist who goes there is not given access. Of course, they didn't build the archive, but they control the archive. So and speaking about making history, making archive, there are similar things. You can erase completely one thread of history as a state, as a nation, and you could build your museums, your archives, according to that agenda. So I think not all archives are positive, but archives are very powerful. Who holds the archive holds the key to public memory.
Maybe I can also add that archive is also about transparency. And in a situation in China, there is so lacking in transparency. Having archives and making certain aspect of history transparent is already a big move towards developing a more sophisticated understanding of the history.
So we got to the topic of state archives versus public interest archives, transparency versus opaqueness, and I think that's an interesting topic also, because we have in Russia the main problem for a historian in Russia is the KGB archives, the former security police, the Soviet security police archive, which is also closed off, and you can go there only through nepotism and corruption, well, basically bribing someone to get the document you want. And so this state control of the archive and state control of history versus the artistic public service control of history, I think, is something that we would want to think about and talk about later in a bit more depth. But right now, I want one more question from the audience. And failing that, please.
And I would be interested what your take on it. We were talking about archives that are state archives that actually restrict access on things. But on the other hand, when you create a public archive at the state or in public service, it's an institution that the goal of it is kind of to preserve the material, whether they're open to the public or not. So in the sense, even if it's a state archive, it's probably kind of more safe as a private family archive that can be, much more easily discarded. So how would you address that distinction? Just to, it's a kind of a state archive that is closed, but nevertheless kind of preserved and waiting for its time to open up for the public.
But if it's closed and if it's in their control, how do you know if they have archived everything?
Well, you do not know, but there is obviously a list, so they're kind of keeping these materials to even to themselves, waiting for their time to open up. The same was, it's a fantastic thing what Garage does, and but there are again a lot of state archives that are closed, and there were some state museums that were closed to certain parts of their collection to the public, but then like some Russian avant-garde was closed for a long time to the public, but they finally, when the time came, it opened up. So I think I just want to kind of emphasize that even though some part of the archives might be closed, but it's kind of the task of it to preserve the material, and I think because of it's an institution, it's kind of a better preserved.
We have 0 minutes.
Thank you very much again. And we have a break for 25 minutes and then we'll resume our...